Okay, so here is the last of your 3 video lectures for today, and this will be the shortest one. I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights from Chapter 9, Women with Disability in Sport, and because you already learned a little bit about the Paralympics, and this chapter talks a little bit about the Paralympics, but you already kind of understand and know that there's um, opportunities for women with disabilities to participate in sport competition at the highest level. And so this is just a quick sort of highlight of the things that are talked about in Chapter 9, and really want to make sure that you do understand that there's some legal protections for people with disabilities to be able to participate freely in sport and have an opportunity with that. So, according to the United Nations, approximately 15% of the world's population has a disability, and opportunities for people with disabilities exist at all different levels. It's a mistake to think that people with disabilities are not interested in sport, because research indicates that people with disabilities are very interested in sport and physical activities if the opportunities are made available to them. Um, there is clear evidence that people with disabilities participating in sport as early as the 18th and 19th centuries in sport activities were instrumental in rehabilitation of people with disabilities back in the 18th and 19th century. We know that sport clubs for the deaf existed in Berlin in 1888. The first silent games were held in 1924. And world games for the deaf have been held every 4 years since 1924. So, of course, the issue we have is that the documented history of these experiences are not highly numbered, or held special enough to pronounce in our canon of history in general, and certainly athletic history. So that is so having this misunderstanding that people with disabilities are not interested in being physically active, or don't have a history of it, is misleading, is misunderstood. Um, so anyway, so it's important to realize that there's definitely a history there of sport for people with disabilities. There's different levels, from grassroots to the Special Olympics to Paralympic, depending on the disability and the opportunity and access to opportunity. There are the legal aspects that help, that apply to athletes with disabilities and help them have experiences. Um, and then the chapter also highlights certain athletes with disabilities, which I think is really cool. Some of the more sort of notable athletes that have excelled, even if they aren't as able-bodied as sort of what we would call our mainstream or general athletic sports that we think about when we think of the competitive sport environment. So anyway, um, let's see. I'm sorry. Um, so people with disabilities face more hurdles to being active and are 3 times more likely to be sedentary than their able-bodied peers, because not only does not everyone have the skills, abilities, resources to access training to be an athlete, or whether that's elite or just sort of a weekend warrior athlete. um, the so we need to be able to provide the resources for them, and to be able to provide the training and the coaching and the advising, the mentoring for them, to meet their needs where their needs are. Some girls with disabilities, really, women with disabilities, just want to get out and be active and move and feel as if they're making strides to stay healthy. And this is one of the biggest reasons why disabled persons want to be able to participate in sport. They want to feel like they're making progress towards a healthier lifestyle. It may mean that they want to go to a pool to swim and exercise in the water, or take a yoga class, play in a adaptive softball league, or um, golf, tennis, any number of sport, or maybe even they just want to visit their local park and take advantage of a handicap accessible nature trail. So um, so there are some activities happening at the grassroots level, recreational activities. Organizations such as Blaze Sports America, they provide a sport opportunity that brings life lessons with them. They have the goals to provide support, um, recreation and physical activity opportunities for people with physical disability in sport comparable to those perceived to be non-disabled. They have national and they are both national and international, and they also really work to provide and build positive perceptions of people with physical disabilities. So they are working, of course, with the population that has the disability to help provide opportunities, but they're also thinking about how they advocate for them and how they help promote a positive perception of people with physical disabilities. Um, there's also things like the U.S. National Park Service. They have a free access pass for people with disabilities, and many of the state and local parks offer similar packages. Numerous cities play host to Miracle League Baseball, and this is where girls and boys with disabilities of all types play baseball on special fields designed for safe use of wheelchairs, walkers, scooters, whatever kind of additional sort of objects that they need to be able to participate in the sport. Um, so there's these grassroots level, sort of local level, state level opportunities that exist for people with disabilities that they can, you know, participate and get out and get active. Um, and then there's also, as we progress up, we also know about the Special Olympics, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar, or at least have some familiarity, if not being very familiar with the Special Olympics, which was founded by Eunice Kennedy Shriver. I think even your book says like there's a good possibility that you've maybe participated, volunteered for Special Olympics. They're very popular. They're very popular events in communities. They're for people with cognitive disabilities. So this is different than Paralympics because the Paralympics is for people with physical disabilities, and the Special Olympics are for people with cognitive disabilities. And Eunice Shriver, when she came up with this idea, she really was recognizing that um, it was about the 50s or 60s, late 50s, early 60s, where she recognized that she could develop these summer day camps for people with disabilities, and the concept really spread quickly across the country, and literally thousands of people with intellectual disabilities were finding themselves being more active, moving and participating through these camps that were being offered for their pleasure, for their experience. Um, and so from that blossomed this concept of the Special Olympics. And on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Special Olympics, Sports Illustrated actually honored Eunice Kennedy Shriver with its inaugural Sportsman of the Year Legacy Award, because they recognized um, that it was so influential to people with cognitive disabilities and providing experience for them like no other that they had experienced prior to the opportunity to participate in a Special Olympic environment. In as recent as 2012, the Special Olympics hit a special milestone. They registered at that point more than 4 million athletes worldwide in its programs. The Special Olympics offers 30 plus Olympic style individual and team sports in its program. Women are active participants, and always have been since the beginning, since its concept inception. Um, and as of 2013, when the year after they hit the 4 million athlete milestone, almost 40% of the Special Olympians were female. So there's definitely a good contingency of participants in the Special Olympics that are female, and a great place for them to get that experience of competition. Um, And then the Paralympics is the other, the Paralympic Games, Olympics are another aspect of this. Is for physical disabilities. This is for an elite level of athlete that can then go on and represent their country at the highest level of competition. It is an Olympic level game. It's recognized on the Olympic, as part of the Olympic calendar and the Olympic program. Um, you know, they've grown women's numbers have grown steadily in the Paralympic movement. Um, the competitions initially um, were recognized for wounded veterans, but women were always involved. They actually established a Women in Sport Commission through the Paralympic Games. And so, because they did that early on, women were always involved, and the numbers have steadily increased, both in participants and then administrators also of the games. Um, so they are definitely visible at the Paralympic Games. Um, they, um, I think it was 40 some women participated in the first Summer Games that were held for the Paralympics, for the para athletes, and just south of 40 for the first Winter Paralympic Games. So they, while their numbers were small, they were always there as participants. They weren't excluded from the beginning, like the regular Summer Olympics were, that Coubertin founded or sort of reestablished from the ancient Olympic Games. Um, so the influence of sport, we know, on the lives of the people with disabilities is immeasurable. Like, it's immeasurably positive. And although you think that these experiences may have been available and abundant, it's just not the case. People that have had disabilities have had to fight over the years for acceptance and access, and so that's where the legal system coming into play was very helpful. For example, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This was the first. What that law states is that no qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall be excluded from, denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity that either receives federal financial assistance or is conducted by any executive agency. Sounds a lot like Title IX, right? And it was the first piece of major legislation to address discrimination against people with disabilities. So, it was enacted a year after Title IX. It definitely resonated with the verbiage, and the idea of what Title IX was doing in terms of sex discrimination with disability discrimination. And so it, it, um, it expanded on the idea of no discrimination based on, um, you know, components of our physical being that we can't help, like we don't control. We can't control if we're physically disabled. We can't control if our sex is one over another sex, and so this is a protection or a right that they were given legal protection to people with disabilities. Um, Basically, Section 504 makes it illegal for any program that gets any kind of federal funds to discriminate against someone because they're disabled. And so this, and it regarding sport and physical activity specifically, this has to do with like an educational environment. Schools need to provide students with disabilities equal opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities. That includes club and varsity and intramural sport programs. So if there's a disabled student that wants to participate in sporting activities, whether it's at a school sanctioned, intercollegiate or interscholastic event, or a club or intramural event, the school needs to find a way to provide that opportunity, um, and allow them to participate in the greatest extent possible. And if they don't do that, then they are discriminating against that student. And so Section 504 makes it possible for students with disabilities to have the opportunity to participate in extracurricular activities, particularly sport, recreational activities. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was expanded on in a Dear Colleague letter of 2013. And that letter actually increased the offerings that are open to students with disabilities, um, the opportunities for participation in school sport. Um, the options were mainstream programs, adaptive physical education and athletic programs, allied or unified sport programs. Um, so and it's not that section 504 states that just because a student with a disability tries out for a team that they're guaranteed a roster spot. They need to show sufficient skills to be able to warrant a place on the team. But they are definitely entitled to a fair tryout. They must be able to have a fair tryout. If they want to try out, they should be able to try out. If they have the skill set that allows them to be an integrated part of the team, then they need to be allowed to be a present and part of the team. So, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, with the sort of expansion in the Dear Colleague letter of 2013, are some of the first legal protections for disabled persons in environments where federal funds are provided, right? So it could happen even outside of educational settings, but this was obviously particularly aimed um, to target educational settings. Um, and then, of course, uh, sorry. So then, of course, there's a growing need to expand this concept or this idea beyond federally funded programming. So about 20 years after Section 504 became a law, much of the language needed to become revisited. And so as a result, that's where we saw the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which I'm sure most of you have some familiarity with, or at least you understand or know that the ADA exists. That's when it was sort of brought to the forefront, and it was actually passed into law in 1990. This piece of legislation extends the extends the rights of disabled people beyond just a federally funded environment, right? So it's not that if you're participating in a activity or an event and it's not a federally funded program, the ADA is written so that it prohibits discrimination on the basis of a disability, particularly in employment. Um, you must have accommodations in commercial facilities, transportation, telecommunications. It also applies to the United States Congress, right? So all of these areas are covered regardless if they're being federally funded or not. When it comes to sport, there's probably the most well-known one is the PGA Tour versus Casey Martin. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and this was Casey Martin was a PGA Tour participant player who had requested to use a cart a golf cart to move throughout the course because of a documented disability, and he was eventually allowed to per the ADA, and so that's probably one of the most sort of like well known, and some of you may have heard about that story, and if not, you read about it in the book. That's probably the most well known instance of where the ADA protected a disabled athlete to be able to participate in an elite level sporting environment. Um, the United Nations has also ratified numerous human rights conventions and treaties that mention sport or physical activities. Um, and they really, what their aim is to eliminate all forms of discrimination against persons with, well, they have a big goal of obviously eliminating all forms of discrimination against women and other marginalized groups, but also women with disabilities. They at the first UN Human Rights Convention of the 21st century, the United Nations, they had a rights of persons with disabilities. They came up with the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, They wanted to connect sport and human rights with those with disabilities and make sure that it was done in a with a human justice thought in mind. So definitely, this is the UN's effort to raise the status of people with disabilities. Um, it was their Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It was ratified into law um, in 2008, so it's a relatively new of all the protections, the legal protections that people with disabilities can realize if they want to participate in sport. This is the newest one of them all, having been ratified in 2008. Your book at this point goes into women leaders in sport, with people with disabilities, for people with disabilities. They talk about Ann Cody, Linda Mastrandrea, Stephanie Wheeler, Tatiana McFadden, Amy Mullins. Some of my favorites are on that list. I love Tatiana McFadden. Amy Mullins is really great. I mean, all of these women are really inspirational. Stephanie Wheeler I've actually met, which is a pretty cool experience. So, these are some good little snippets of their bios are in the book, and they're really great, worth reading. And so, the last inquiry form I'm going to ask you is, which of these women have you found the most? Did you find the most interesting to read about? And also, along with that, have you ever witnessed, have you ever watched, experienced, seen any kind of disabled sport competition? Have you ever seen a Paralympic event? Have you ever gone to a Special Olympic event? I'm just curious what any kind of experience you have in seeing um, sort of other abled capabilities, um, humans, what they are able to do. Like, I've seen a lot of wheelchair basketball, and I'm just absolutely blown away by how these humans adapt with the special wheelchairs that they use, and how they move on that court is really fascinating. That's where I met Stephanie Wheeler, was through that experience. And so, any kind of adaptive sport environment for people with disabilities, I'm curious if you've had any experience watching, helping volunteer at, just seeing and experiencing and interacting with any kind of environment where there's a sort of an adaptive sport format. So let me know about that as well, along with which of these women highlighted in your book did you find like really interesting, and sort of would maybe like to know more about their story. Um, anyway, so I think from there, the future of for girls and women with disabilities in sport is that we have to think about increasing participation of women and girls with disabilities at a grassroots level, at a local level, trying to get them involved as much as possible. We need to really think about how do we provide more competitive sport opportunities. We need to showcase female athletes with disabilities in sport to show that this is possible, this is wanted, this is celebrated. This is something we want to see more women with disabilities getting involved in. Um, we also need to see allies, right? So women and men without disabilities need to recruit more female athletes with disabilities to participate in sport, or if they're just really not into sport, or they you know are beyond participating in sport. Maybe it's that they are a part of administrative level decision making that helps provide and create opportunity for disabled people to participate in sport. Um, and maybe they become a coach. We just need to develop more trained coaches, and that can work with athletes with disabilities. So even that way to get them involved in participation in sport would be really phenomenal. We have to think about sport as a right. The practice of sport is a human right. If someone wants to be able to participate in sport, we have to recognize that that is a human right, and it means for everyone, men and women, people who are able-bodied, and people with disabilities or other able abilities. So, sport in and of itself is neither positive nor negative, but it has the power to transform us and make us all more fully human. And so, we want everybody to be able to have access to sport, and remember that sport is a right. Um, so, uh, this concludes the three video lectures for this week. And remember, again, one last little reminder about your paper, based on the content of Chapter 8, but really mostly from interviews that you're going to do with family members. So again, make sure if you haven't looked at those yet, that assignment yet, get on that because it's due Wednesday, next Wednesday, and you'll want to be able to have the opportunity to talk to the women in your family as quick as you can to be able to work with them on that. So enjoy, and we'll see you next week.